welcome to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Welcome to another episode of the God Conclusion. Today we have Dr. Steve Miller of Kennesaw State University, and we're going to be discussing his book on deathbed experiences. Without further ado, welcome again, Dr. Miller. I had the honor and privilege of meeting you in person at a panel discussion earlier this week. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Dr. Michael Sabom is, to me, the pioneer that actually put near-death experiences on a scientific basis with his study. And also he studied out the Pam Reynolds case and presented it to the world, which is probably one of the best documented cases ever. When he started out his research, he didn't really he believed all this near-death experience stuff was just hogwash, was his word. Didn't believe it at all until somebody challenged him. Talk to your patients. He was a cardiologist. And I think it was the third one he talked about this dramatic near death experience. And he said, Why hadn't you ever told me about it? And he said, You'd be the last person I'd tell about something like this. You're going to get thrown in the psychiatric ward if you start talking that way to your cardiologist. To me, it's just a great privilege to have this panel discussion with him. They thought that I was an expert via my research on near death and deathbed experiences and pulling all the research together on these in my books. But he's the one who actually did some of the original research himself, interviewing patients, checking hospital records, and saying, oh, wow, when you claim to have seen something when you were clinically dead, now I've got evidence of it because I've talked to the surgeon, talked to the people that were at the case, looked at physicians' records to make sure you weren't on morphine or something weird. It was just a privilege to be able to do a panel discussion with him. And thanks for being there. It was fun meeting you face to face.
It was great. I really enjoyed it. I had some questions about your book on deathbed experiences. First, I want to say once again that your writing style, you have an academic, professorial approach in the delivery of the subject matter, but your writing style is much more like a storyteller. You convey these stories about people so that you're able to relate to them. And there was one in particular that there's a guy that I'm very interested in. His name is Michael Shermer. He is a very renowned skeptic. And you had a story about him in your book. I was wondering if you could share that with the listeners.
Sure. Anybody can read his original description of what happened in an article. Just search infrequencies. It was an article that he published in Scientific American, October of 2014. Michael Shermer. It's online free. You can look at it. Then later he put it in his book on on the afterlife, where he was giving an atheistic view of there being no afterlife. But it was a very interesting case because here's a person who's debunked things like this all his life, had a regular column, skeptic column in Scientific American, and then all of a sudden he has this experience. And here was the experience because it relates to one of the deathbed experiences, which is really a conglomeration of several types of experience. So his would be called an after death communication, or ADC. There's been a lot of study on these globally. They happen. They found it in a Harvard grief study which is a very significant study coming out of the psychiatric department of Harvard on grieving people. A surprise finding was that a lot of these people had experiences where they felt like they were back in touch with their deceased loved one, maybe a very dramatic appearance to them of this. So, anyway, it's been studied much since then. People have done dissertations on them. It's very common happening, particularly among the grieving. So, Shermer had his own. So Shermer was just getting married. His wife was from Germany, and it was a small wedding in a home. And she was grieving that her grandfather, who was very influential in her life, he had since passed away, that he could not be there to experience it. Just after the wedding, and she's thinking about all these things, and she goes back into they're back in the bedroom, and they hear romantic music emanating from somewhere, and they thought, where is this coming from? They've traced it to a drawer, open it up, there was this little radio, that an old radio that she had inherited from her grandfather, where they used to listen to music, and it was playing this romantic music. She said, "It's my grandfather. He's with us now." Now, she was skeptical of all these things, just like she was a skeptic like Shermer, but she took it that this was something special. What about the timing? So the history of that radio was this. The radio, she had brought it back from Germany, but he could never get it working. He tried to change the batteries, he looked at the soldering, he looked at everything. Nothing worked to get it started. So he had just thrown it in the drawer as a memento. But then all of a sudden, months later, boom, right at the time that she needed some kind of assurance from her granddad, it comes on. Now, I'm looking at it, I'm saying, what are the odds of that? That's very small odds. Now, Shermer said it really shook his worldview in that first article. Later, he came around and he rationalized it and said, okay, a lot of weird things happen in this world. He says, people wrote in, my skeptical friends, and said things like, maybe it was a sunspot. Maybe it was this or that, some kind of scientific happening that happened. But Shermer came back and said, yeah, but what about the timing? Why would a sunspot hit right at that hour? So I sat down and just figured up the odds. What are the odds of this happening? Number one, you've got this is not a digital player that automatically might find the right music, right? This is an old one where you have to turn the knob and it can be between stations. It can be on. The odds are it would not even be tuned to a station. Came
It'd be
from
static.
Germany. It came from Germany. This was tuned to stations there, come to the United States, and it's tuned to a romantic station playing romantic songs. It worked for about 24 hours, then stopped. They never got it started again. Shermer decided, he said, okay, but I don't know how to explain this. But he said, in the end, there's no reason to bring in God or the afterlife or anything like this. Let's just take it as something weird that happened that science doesn't understand yet and just appreciate the wonder of it all. After all, he says, weird things happen. There are billions of people in the world. When you got billions of people, weird things are going to happen. Now, I'm going to say, okay, you said earlier in your book that that the scientific thing is to find. He quoted someone, I believe it was a physicist, who said, "Find the strangest thing in your field and explore it." That's how you get into new research, right? And I thought, Shermer, why didn't you take this strange thing that happened and actually research it? Because it turns out it's so common to people who've never had some kind of a weird experience before with a deceased loved one. It's so common that this can't be explained just by saying it's one out of billions of people. And it's not just, oh, you have so many dreams. Let's see the number of dreams. Yeah, it wasn't a dream. It was something that happened when they were wide awake. Even if it was a dream, these people are reporting it as such a vivid dream that it's the only one they've had in their lifetime. So I don't think you can get away with just saying, "Oh, there are billions of people, weird things are gonna happen." So once I added the odds of this 1978 Philips 070 transistor radio, number 1, being on the right station, number 2, turning on all of a sudden at the exact time where it could have been 3 months before, 3 months after, why would it happen right in that hour? So it would seem the odds of this event happening naturalistically total, I thought, as 1 chance in 4,320 for the timing times 1 chance in 200, it being on the right station, giving us the odds of 1 chance in 864,000, which is approaching 1 in a million. But it's just interesting to me. I think it says a lot about how we evaluate things. Our our own paradigms, our own worldviews tend to be the lens through which we see things, and our mind refuses to look objectively at the evidence when we've got a strong opinion. Me as a Christian, I have to watch that because I'm going to have the same tendency as Shermer is. I'm going to want to see God at the end of it. He's going to want to see naturalism, but I think we have to try as best we can to get objective. And so what I do is I give his example there, write it out both as is in his article and in the book when he tries to explain it away, and then say, okay, let's look at the broader research. Are there other cases that show that this is really happening and that there's actually evidence that these things are somehow supernatural or evidence of the afterlife?
Wow, there's so much there to talk about.
There is. It's interesting.
First of all, with Mr. Shermer, I would take issue with one thing that you said, and that you referred to him as a skeptic. And I know that you are a skeptical person, and I
Yeah.
like to consider myself a skeptical person. I think I've revealed to you in the past in our conversations that which more commonly are known as ghosts, and those are primarily because of a number of personal experiences that I had as a teenager. But they weren't anecdotes to me, they were empirical evidence because I observed them. And in the case of Michael Shermer, he's not a skeptic, he's a denier. And
Hmm.
I'll give you an example of something that I saw one time. He's very well known. He's in a lot of these documentaries, and I'm addicted to them, I'll confess, where they explore the unexplained and try to come up with a rational explanation for
By the way, this
it.
is his book, Heavens on Earth, Michael Shermer, The Scientific Search for the Afterlife. Now, again, I'm saying he's saying the scientific search, and I'm saying I think if you look at it scientifically, you really need to deal with all of this scientific research that's been done rather than just explain things away.
No, you're fine. But that's exactly what he does. He cherry picks the evidence that he wants to look at, and he rips it apart, and he denies the other evidence. He was on this television program, and they were testing alleged psychics.
Hmm.
And most of these people seem to be frauds.
Hmm.
And one of them appeared to show some real potential. And so Shermer said, I want to test this person myself. And he said, I'm going to take a photograph and I'm going to put this photograph in an envelope and seal it. And I'm going to ask the psychic to identify the contents of the photograph. And I thought, that's a pretty good test. You can do a rocket, you could do a car, you could do a human being, you could
Almost
do
infinite number of
you
choices.
could do a leprechaun.
Right.
What did he choose? He chose a photograph of deep space taken from the Hubble telescope.
Okay.
So it's nothing. There's nothing to depict in this photograph. It's just swirls and stars, it's colors and shapes, but it's not any discernible image that somebody could allegedly telepathically see and identify. So the guy just drew squirrels and squiggles and shapes and said that's all I could see was just a bunch of gibberish nonsense. And Sherman
Mhm.
said, that proves he didn't see what I saw.
Mm.
He didn't show anything. He could have taken your book and just put a picture of your book in that envelope. And so, what is in there? And the guy could have said, it's a tree. It's a picture of a tree, and debunked it. But what he did was he tried to plant the seeds of doubt, which really are a justification for his disbelief.
Mhm. I think he's a skeptic when it comes to things that he doesn't believe. He'll search into certain things that he doesn't believe in and be skeptical. But most skeptics who are really naturalists, they're not very skeptical of their skepticism. They're limited skeptics. And in fact, I've seen so few atheists or naturalists who will actually even read the other side. It's just shocking. I don't know if you've read many of the new atheists, but when you read these guys, they just do not research the other side. And so when they're arguing against arguments from the other side, it's usually an argument as put by another atheist that they've read because they love reading atheists, they love reading skeptics. And I think what they do is if they read people who are arguing for the afterlife and God at all, they're reading in order to find fault. And then when they read their own skeptical literature, they're reading to get ammunition. And so in neither case are you really being objective. Now they think they're being objective, but it seems to me that when the Bible describes spiritual blindness, this is exactly what I'm seeing in people like Richard Dawkins. He can't get the cosmological argument right as put by other people that are Christians or Aquinas or any of the traditional formulations of it. Neither can Bertrand Russell, could never get it right. Why aren't they reading the other side? In fact, Bertrand Russell was studying at Cambridge at the same time that some of these researchers into deathbed experiences were there. Henry Sidgwick was teaching there at Cambridge. Henry Sidgwick was so respected as a moral philosopher, an economist, and just a leader and a very objective researcher, was so respected that here it is 100 years later, and you've got this huge intellectual biography written with Cambridge University Press from a professor at University of Chicago. So these guys studied deathbed experiences, which we'll talk about in a minute. Bertrand Russell was there. Why doesn't he seem to even be familiar with their research that they did, which was widely publicized at the time, and comment on it? I think they just didn't like to look at evidence against their beliefs, as much as they claim to be objective researchers and scientific people.
There's a physicist named Sean Carroll who's again rather well known in atheist circles, and he
I've
debated
read
Dr.
him.
Dr. William Lane Craig. And I actually had an email exchange with him one time because he was on a panel for atheism, and he said rather emphatically, I know what happens when we die.
Hmm.
And I've done a lot of research into the near death experience and now reading your book on the deathbed experience. And I've come to some conclusions that are pretty strong, but I would never claim absolute knowledge of what happens when we die because I haven't died. But
Right.
he arrogantly, in my opinion, said that he knew. And then when I pressed him on it, he said, I asked him if he looked into the evidence for corroborated veridical NDE perceptions. And he said, I only look at and evaluate evidence that interests me.
That's a great admission on his part. I admire
Isn't
him
it?
for admitting that. And I read someone else the other day who was an atheist, and they said the neat thing about an atheist is I just don't have to worry about that stuff or think about it. And he just admitted he really doesn't think about it much. And I think that's being honest, I appreciate that. So they just don't tend to read the other side. And yet they make dogmatic pronouncements as if they've studied both sides. That's what I did when I tried to go. You got your University of Georgia shirt on. When I was at that
Yeah.
stage of my life going to school, I studied at some Christian schools. And then I thought I was going through questioning, doubting the Bible and God and all this stuff. So I went to the University of Georgia, 2 different quarters, studied as a transient student, we called it. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take all the courses that I think would be the hardest for Christians to deal with, like philosophy, psychology of religion, deductive logic. Let's look at all these things that worry people. And I want to actually hear it taught by the people who believe that way. And that helped me to work through my doubts. So I was trying to be objective and read both sides of best of both sides of things. But what I'm seeing in the so-called skeptics is they're not skeptical enough of their own paradigm to actually read the best material against their beliefs.
Before we move on from Michael Shermer and his anecdote, I wanted to say I really and truly appreciated one aspect of your academic approach to it, to the problem. You tried to calculate the probability, and you did that by multiplying the probability of the radio signal being perfectly tuned in and the probability of the timing of the radio coming on, and you multiplied those two probabilities to come up with a number that was 1 in a million. And in my book, The God Conclusion, I tried to take a similar approach, but I didn't really have the courage to do it. What I did was I said, there's a probability of the universe popping into existence from nothing via random processes. And that number has been calculated by Sir Martin Rees and Roger Penrose.
Hmm.
And so they have assessed that value and they said it's 1 in 10 to the 300th power, which
Hmm.
I know is a very small number.
I think
And
the
then the
240th power, if I'm thinking correctly, for another one that a skeptic that went in and looked at it and that changed his mind on intelligent design. Frederick Hoyle actually wrote a couple of books where he looked into the mathematics of evolution, and that's what he found. These are just infinitesimally small odds of this whole thing happening by chance.
But there's what I call the three miracles that or four miracles that allow human beings to exist and for us to have this conversation today. There's the miracle of the Big Bang. There's the miracle of cosmic inflation, which took place immediately following the Big Bang. There's a miracle of the origin of life or abiogenesis. And then there's the miracle of consciousness, where we both are sentient creatures and can have a conversation where we're exchanging ideas and communicating on some level. Those are the odds against any one of those events coming into fruition are infinitesimally small. But I wrote an article called Compounded Improbabilities, and I tried to multiply them all together to come
Hmm.
up with a really absurd number. And I said, 1 in 10 to the 300th power is pretty absurd in and of itself. So I just said, you could just take the worst case scenario number of cosmic inflation is 1 in a million, and odds against success. And I don't recall what the numbers are for abiogenesis, but you have validated what I wanted to do in my book, and didn't quite have the guts to step forward forcefully and insist that is how it should be perceived in the odds of our existence.
I had to look it up as well, like you did, to make sure I was doing the math correctly. I thought, okay, do you add these together or do you multiply them together? So I went in to make sure I was doing it correctly, the way you do things statistically. But yeah, it's quite amazing. In fact, in my little book on evidence for the existence of God, I have 17 lines of evidence that really I think you could multiply all those out when it comes to the odds. Like people that have had some kind of a remarkable vision that somehow came true or was. I'll give you an example of another after death communication. I give several examples, not just Shermer's, but some that were found in these studies, dissertations, and others that were well done, looked into. But there was a mother whose, I believe it was her father who had passed away. And yeah, her father, in the middle of the night, she woke up, saw the father in the room, and they had a chat. And she just thought, this is crazy. This had to have been something. She tried to explain it away as some kind of lucid dream or whatever. He said, I've got to walk down the hall and say hi to my grandchild. And then, so she finally made it back to sleep the next day before she said anything. And I think it was like a 5-year old little child came up and said, Hey, I talked to granddaddy last night. And she said, Really? What did he say? And it was like, Hey, here are two witnesses. The Bible talks about establishing everything with two witnesses. You can't just throw it away as a hallucination. If this is somebody that's been interviewed, that's been talked to, and you say, okay, I believe that this is a reliable person. And now that I've seen these documented in studies, I'm starting to ask my relatives and circles of trust, people that I trust that I've known a long time, and they'll start opening up to me about experiences they had that have just been remarkable.
One of the points that you make in the book is that the numbers appear to be low, even though that it is a substantial percentage of the population in total that has experiences of this nature. But one of the reasons it seems to be underreported is that people, when they come back from a near death experience, they're reluctant to talk about it because they don't want people to think that they're crazy.
Yeah, I think that naturalism was so strong in the 1900s that it's made cowards of all of us. It tried, under naturalism, you explained away all this demonic world and miracles and said, okay, we're in a scientific age now. So if you think you're experiencing those things, that's really some kind of a psychological problem. And so we felt like here in Europe and the United States, that if something happened to us like this, we didn't broadcast it because we were afraid people would think we were crazy. And so it really wasn't until Moody wrote his book, and I think why it resonated with so many people is that so many people had had these experiences. Studies in Australia, Germany, United States, I know surveys were done in at least these three countries, and it was like 4 to 6% of the population. That's like over 1 in 25 people. If you have 25 people over for Thanksgiving, one of them may have had a near death experience. And then when you get into deathbed visions, that becomes like over 80% of the dying, which makes it more intrinsic with dying. You're saying the percentages of people. I think if you add up the amount of people who have near death experiences, who have deathbed experiences, have maybe claimed to have seen an angel in a crisis point in their life or something like that. I'm wondering if almost everybody will have some type of experience similar to this by the time they die.
You said 1 in 25 at Thanksgiving dinner, but I would suggest or argue that's 1 in 25 who's willing to talk about it.
That
The,
has to be considered. This is a conservative estimate.
yes, absolutely. But getting back to the story that you were talking about, you in the book you talk about shared death experiences, but in that instance of the mother and the child, that's more like a shared after death communication, wouldn't you say?
I
it's
think that
it's hard to
shared,
categorize some of these
right.
experiences.
So, near death experience, somebody has cardiac arrest, experiences cessation of breathing and respiration and heartbeat. And so they're clinically dead. And then they come back to talk about it. So that's like a halftime experience, something that's going on during your life. A deathbed experience, this is really a conglomeration of several types of experiences that happen before a person's final death. So I should mention that these are deathbed visions, which have been studied a long time. In fact, I could show you some of these books because I like to get people reading about them. This was written by a physicist, a very famous and well respected physicist, Sir William Barrett. He was knighted. They don't just knight anybody. And he was a professor at a respected university in Europe. One day, his wife, who was a physician, came back and said there was a lady who was giving birth to a child and she ended up dying. But as she was dying, she began talking about the wonderful vistas she was seeing on the other side. And rather than being just cringing in pain or fear or, oh no, am I going to ever see anybody here again? She gets super excited about where she's going and beautiful, wonderful creatures she talked about. And then she said, oh, so and so is here. Why is she here? Then she said, I'm so glad that you're going with me. So they showed her the baby. She said, should I stay for the baby's sake? And then she says, no, you can't understand what I'm seeing. If you did, you'd understand I can't come back. And then she died. That person she was shocked to see on the other side was someone who had died while she was there. Nobody told her about the death because they were afraid of upsetting her. How did she see somebody that she did not know had died? And that is a common experience as well. So, deathbed visions, shared death experiences. Did I talk about my cousin Bucky in the last time I had an interview?
I think we did talk about Bucky briefly, but we can always talk about him again.
Sure. This is, and I didn't mention it in the panel discussion during the week why I respect him so much. This is a relative of mine. He'd come to where I was taking care of my mother, was visiting, and mom said, tell him what you're studying. I said, near death experiences. He said, oh, I've had three of these. I'll tell you about them. And actually, one was probably an angel that saved him from a wreck. He was coming, cresting a hill, and he builds dragsters and different things. Okay, he likes to go fast on these middle Georgia long straight roads, and so he was cresting a hill, and something said from the back seat, "Slow down." He just looked around and ignored it. He thought there's nobody in here, and then it like pinched him on the shoulder like a grandmom does, and says, "Slow down." He slowed down at the crest. There was a transfer truck coming toward him. There was a food truck that was off to the side of the road partially. He said, "Had I not slowed down, this would have been a terrible accident." So that was an experience of his. And then he said, in the middle of the night, like I think he said 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke up with a feeling of something extremely heavy on his chest. He came out of his body, looked down at his body, saw a tunnel of light in the corner of the room, taught some angelic beings, felt incredible peace, came back into his body, and woke up in a cold sweat. No, it's like this doesn't happen every day. This is the only time it ever happened. And immediately the phone rang saying that his dad had just died of a massive heart attack. He didn't know his dad was ill, had no idea why would it all happen during that time. That's called either a crisis apparition or more likely a shared death experience. You can't explain that by hypotheses of a dying brain by saying, oh, maybe Bucky was just, maybe he was low on oxygen. Maybe there was something going into his head that goes into our head at the time of death, like a DMT or something that's going through your brain. If all these naturalistic explanations are talking about things that would happen with a dying brain, his brain wasn't dying. But one reason I trust Bucky, he's well respected within the family. He's never talked about these things before to me, so he's not the type that broadcasts every miracle like some people do. And he was a history teacher all his life, after masters in history, very intelligent fellow. Regarding deathbed experiences, you've got the shared death experience, you've got deathbed visions that I mentioned, terminal lucidity is another one where you somebody who may have been dying of Alzheimer's or something that just tears apart at the brain. You go comatose maybe toward the end, and then at the end you wake up perfectly lucid, say your goodbyes or ask forgiveness of people that need, do your last things, and then boom, you die. All these are very well attested in the medical literature, and so they're all part of what I'm calling the deathbed experience.
Wow. When I first went to work for what was Burroughs Corporation years and years ago, I was sent to a week of orientation training type thing because this big computer corporation, you're coming in on the ground level. And so they don't just immediately throw you in the job, they send you off to classes and that kind of stuff. And there was a guy that I met in class and I never saw him again, but we spoke every day when we were in class buddies,
Mhm.
if you will. And I noticed that he had a skin condition. It was psoriasis or something like that, eczema, I think it was. And his skin was constantly irritated. And out of the blue, he said, my father had the same condition and struggled with it his entire life. But the day he died, his skin went pristine. He had no blemishes on it whatsoever.
Interesting.
And I didn't know how to respond to that because I'm a kid basically just out of college. And I didn't this is sharing personal information, that kind of stuff. But that stuck with me all these years. And now we're having this conversation and it suddenly seems relevant.
You get two techies in one room and nobody knows what's relevant to what you ought to be talking about at a time like this. So you probably just changed the subject and said, "Oh, and where are you from?" And that's what we typically do. We get nervous when we start somebody says something a little bit weird, we would get nervous, change the subject,
That
do
was
something else.
years before I started to develop any interest in the near death experience. That didn't come until my aunt got terminal cancer in the mid 1990s.
Hmm.
And so then I started reading the books, Raymond Moody, and
Mhm.
all of the same people I think that you've read, and then you've read many more. But
I
it,
like I like that you mentioned earlier, you clarified about anecdotes. In in Shermer's case, he mentions in evaluating that the case with the radio, he says, "Well, of course, we don't believe things based on anecdotes and whatever." And I thought that this is usually you use the word anecdote to put down somebody's evidence because this was just coming from a person that nobody knew. You didn't know whether to trust them or not, and who knows whether they're reliable or not. You call that anecdotal evidence. That's what we talk about in legal science. That's just anecdote. Somebody overheard something, hearsay, whatever. But when scientists do studies of, let's say, pain medications, they've got to trust these people's reports and to assess, okay, do they have any reason in this, are we paying them for this, are they hoping that they're going to get us to prescribe them some pain medication? They've got to assess all this in order to decide if the pain medication works. So I heard someone the other day say that, if you do you know what it's called when you got more than one anecdote? And the person says no, and he says we call it data, because once you get many people in a court of law attesting that they saw something, and these are reliable witnesses, they don't have reasons to be lying, that's called evidence. That's data that you use as a part of a case. So that's why I've tried to stick in my books with looking at good studies done by people who actually interviewed people, and rather than just pulling things off the internet or reading people's paperback books about their experiences, and I don't know whether to trust them or not. I want people who don't have an alternative reason for making up some story, such as the ones that Sabom interviewed among the cardiac patients that formed the basis of his first study.
what astounded me so much from reading your book was the number of studies that you have documented over I would say at least 100-year period, going back to phantasms of the living, the British census of hallucinations, which I don't like that wording. I think that
No, I
hallu-
don't either.
hallucination is an ugly word, just like anecdote. The Harvard bereavement study, continuing bonds. I mean, you've got a wealth of information because some of these, Henry Sidgwick, you mentioned him earlier, 410 interviewers and 17,000 participants in the
Yeah,
study.
they interviewed so there was an international psychological association that commissioned them to do this study. They were studying one of the deathbed experiences I talk about, which is crisis apparitions, where somebody will wake up in the middle of the night and unlike Bucky, who just experienced a part of the death of his father, they actually see a family member or friend like they're saying goodbye. They'll jot down, "Hey, I saw so and so tonight. I think what he meant was that he's died," and they
Oh,
put it on their calendar.
there's a great example of this in your book. I was just reading about it earlier this morning, where a woman is in bed with her husband, and she wakes up and sees a neighbor that she hasn't seen in over 10 years, who the last time she saw him, she was under the impression that he was going into the priesthood.
Mhm.
And then she sees him in a Navy uniform, and he comes and says, "I came to say goodbye." And when she wakes up, she thinks it's just a vivid dream. But then she receives a letter 3 days later from her mother saying that the person who showed up was in the military as a chaplain, and he'd been killed in action. And
And
to
often this
me,
is like on another continent.
yeah, to me, this is you have to get into, you have to twist yourself into a pretzel to argue against the evidence if it can be corroborated, if the letter can be produced, if the mother can be questioned, if the person who, of all of this documentation, as in the case of Pam Reynolds, where Dr. Sabom went through and meticulously looked at the medical records, the EEGs, the transcripts of the surgery, and he pieced together exactly what happened in the order it happened.
And so Shermer's going to come back and say, okay, the example you just shared, you have enough people with enough dreams and billions of people in the world. Sometimes somebody's going to have an experience like that where they see someone and yeah, they see them dressed in a military uniform and then it turns out it's all right. And it was the same time and other atheists will say, we just don't understand the power of large numbers. This could happen to anybody. So that's precisely what Henry Sidgwick, his wife, and others were studying back in the late 1800s, like 1890s. They did a preliminary study that came out in two huge volumes, and then they did their real study from what they had learned there. They had a statistician who was one of the top statistics people in the world that they ran it by to make sure they were doing their statistics correctly. But they surveyed randomly, like you said, 17,000 people. Now, David Hume had said, famous atheist philosopher, had said all these reports of miracles and supernatural things, they come from ignorant times and ignorant peoples, and we just can't trust them. It's significant that their data, their people they were interviewing, the 17,000, they were typically somewhere around Cambridge or Oxford. William James, one of the most celebrated intellectuals who ever taught at Harvard, was interviewing people around the Harvard area. They had many interviewers, and they what they determined was 10%, and this survey has been done several places, several different times, and always comes to somewhere around 10% of the population claims that they've seen someone who was not physically there. 10% of the population. Now, either we're all crazy or this is a significant group and at least it's something that should be studied. So the largest category under that 10% were people who had a crisis apparition. They saw the person that they saw that wasn't physically there was there in some kind of spiritual body telling them goodbye, and they found out the person had died. Okay, now the Sidgwick's thought statistically, okay, we're not going to go all the way to the afterlife or proving this stuff. We just want to show that this is outside the reach of chance, because they said we know the odds from different statistics that somebody will die in any given 24-hour period. We've got all these people that we found that had this experience. If it's just chance, what are the odds that they would get it within a 24-hour period? 12 hours before their death or 12 hours before, 12 hours before or after they had this vision. And they determined that it was like 220 times as many people as you should have if it were chance, not just twice as many as you should have, not just four times as many, but many times. And they said this is just one thing we can determine is that these did not happen by chance. And yet that's what Shermer and all these keep coming back to, and they don't seem to have even read these studies that were published in an academic journal. Well done. And one reason I went back to read Henry Sidgwick's autobiography, him and his wife were just very detached people regarding their research. These were not Christian pastors trying to prove the afterlife. They were very detached academics that were probably boring to sit under because they're not getting all excited about things. And for them to come to the conclusion of one thing we know, chance cannot explain this, that is very significant coming from those people. Mrs. Sedgwick is the one who probably actually wrote up the study based on all of their conclusions. And they were actually doing a lot of the interviews with these people who had the experiences. They would check out newspaper records to see when this person actually died. They would make sure they're talking to sane people. I doubt there'll ever be another study of this magnitude done. I thought it was very well done.
Again, I was very interested in that study, and the conclusion of that study, I copied a quote of that into my notes. It said, "Between deaths and apparitions of the dying person, a connection exists which is not due to chance alone. We hold this as a proved fact."
Yeah,
And
they
that
didn't talk about proved facts very much because they were so detached. So for them to come to that conclusion was very significant. And I think they did. I read the whole study. I think it's remarkable.
And then William James called this phenomena veridical hallucinations. But that's an oxymoron, isn't it? If
Well,
something is
today I've got this old Webster's dictionary. It's about this thick from way back, and often I'll look at what did these terms mean back in the 1800s that I'm reading, if I'm reading from another time period. And a hallucination back then just meant something that you're seeing that's very remarkable, exceptional, out of the ordinary, and did not necessarily imply that it did not exist. Today, when we say hallucination, we think people are seeing something that's not there. Typically, that's what we think of in hallucination. But back at that time, they often use the word hallucination just to mean that you saw some type of visionary experience, but you weren't implying that it didn't happen. So you have to understand the use of the word hallucination during their time.
I grudgingly concede that's an accurate description of what was going on, but I still don't like the fact because of our modern definition of hallucination to mean that it's a false
Right.
memory. And I'm all about memories that can be accurately validated by investigators like Dr. Sabom after the fact. He can look at the data, the transcript of the record, and say, yes, this conversation between the cardiovascular surgeon and the neurosurgeon took place as the patient described at such and such a time. It if it's accurate, in my opinion, it shouldn't be classified or called a hallucination
It
because
should not be, and I guess we ought to. I wish it. I wish the whole title of these things, talking about hallucinations and whatever, or William James using the word hallucination, I almost feel like it ought to be translated in today's language so that we don't have to deal with that confusion. Because obviously, when they say this cannot be explained by chance, they don't believe it's a hallucination in the sense of that they saw something that wasn't really there.
exactly. You there's someone named Camille Flammarion. I apologize if I'm butchering the name.
I'm glad you
Uh,
butchered it instead of me. I'm sure the French are all squirming right now because it was a French name. He lived in France.
he also wrote a book and had 4,000 reports, and he was concluding that a mind or a soul or a spirit exists apart from the material brain. And during the panel discussion, just as an aside, I think I was either talking to you or Dr. Sabom about whether the mind and the brain are the physical and metaphysical connection, and the heart and the soul might be. But I don't know if you can differentiate between mind and soul. It's an immaterial manifestation of our persona. When you or I die, and oh, another thing I loved was your sense of humor in your book. The prediction of death is 100%, and you're only off by just the slightest fraction. Because I have to remind you,
I know. Go
Enoch.
ahead. True, true, true. There are a couple who didn't die. But I think I was talking to defend my thing. I was saying that the death rate in the United States is 100%.
And
Everybody's going to
I
die.
think
Everybody's going to die. But see, Enoch wasn't in the United States, so I avoided your pitfall.
there you go.
Camille Flammarion. Okay. Now, this is interesting because when I get to the end of my book, I start summing up this evidence. And I think a part of the evidence is the fact that today, when you see Dr. Sabom, he's in his late 70s or into his 80s. These people they've had since 1975 when Moody published his book, and Moody's still alive today. Okay. So you got Moody, Bruce Grayson. A lot of these had very interesting. If you read Bruce Grayson's book, in his just published a few years ago, he's just, I think, at the point of retirement from the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, but they've had a whole lifetime to study these things, and they have really done a good job of publishing numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, books on this subject. And at the end, what are they saying? What's their conclusion? There's something spiritual going on here. Moody was a very skeptical guy. I asked him about it one time on the phone. I said, okay, you get to the end of your book talking about 150 different near death experiences, and you don't conclude it has anything to do with the afterlife. You just say, well, it's actually just a bunch of personal testimonies. I said, why didn't you seem to have a lot of evidence that these were real? What took you so long to become convinced that there was really an afterlife? And he said, I was a philosopher. He studied philosophy at the University of Virginia, got his PhD in philosophy, began teaching philosophy. But he was just a great admirer of Socrates and people like this. And he said, I just admired their detachment from the evidence. And he said, I was afraid that if I came to a conclusion, I'd stop searching. And so he had a prejudice against coming to a firm conclusion. But in the end, in later years, he said, okay, I've seen enough. There's an afterlife. You got Sabom saying there's something spiritual going on. They're coming out of their bodies. You got Bruce Grayson with a lifetime of study. We can also look back at these people who were first studying deathbed experiences, the Sidgwicks. Okay. They had a lot of time to study this. You also had William Barrett. He wrote that book on deathbed visions. He went on to write two or three other books that I read. I- a world class scientist studying this. And throughout his life, he kept gathering evidence and said, there's an afterlife. People are experiencing this before they die. Camille Flammarion, 1899, he's decided to solicit deathbed phenomena cases in three French journals. So, in these journals, he said, if you've had experiences, I want to hear about them. And so people began to write to him about these experiences. That was toward the beginning of his career. Throughout his career, people kept writing him about these. Toward the end of his life, I believe it was in the last 5 years of his life, he puts out several volumes telling about these experiences that were personally told to him. Often he would go back to get details to confirm them. Many of these were crisis apparitions, and he wrote about them. But an interesting thing about his today, typically people won't give a person's name that they interviewed in order to keep it private. He gave the names where the people lived, and often these were well-known princes, people of high ranking in various countries. Why would they share their experiences openly with him? Because he was a respected scientist. He was the most respected astronomer at his time, helped to publish the first astronomy journal in France, extremely respected. So high ranking people felt comfortable to share their experiences, and he would put their name. Okay, this person was the head of the hospital, this person was the head of a denomination, this person was a political figure, and you recognize a lot of the names of history, and he puts them in three volumes. Again, he had his whole life to think about these things, and he was just looking through, sifting the evidence with each of these to show that these cannot be explained naturalistically. Something supernatural is going on here. It's a spiritual experience. They're seeing things that they couldn't have known otherwise. So at the end of my book, I try to sum it up and to say, over 90 years, talented intellects holding research degrees, typically PhDs in a variety of fields. Some were psychologists, some were physicists, all kinds of areas. They studied various aspects of DBEs for significant portions of their lives. This interdisciplinarity is significant, preempting charges that could be directed at them if they had all been specialists in religious studies or pastors or whatever. Altogether, they collected and reflected upon over 30,000 cases, reported their research in 10 volumes comprising almost 6,000 pages. This doesn't even take into account the scads of magazine and journal articles they published, the theme. So there's probably much more than this, but I'm just saying from the ones that I studied that were great, respected intellects who did studies of these, collected them over a lifetime. Wow, that's a lot of research came, and all of them concluded there's something spiritual going on here. This can't be explained naturalistically. I think that's significant and warrants anybody's study.
Absolutely. I had a dog under my feet and I didn't realize it.
Dogs
Um,
happen. Yeah, I've got
they
mine
they
locked on the
do.
other side of the house. My wife's a rescuer, so we do the best we can, and I'm proud of her for rescuing those guys.
Oh, I did rescue there for a long time myself. In fact, oh, I've still take my headphones off for a second. Sorry.
Sounds
I
like we're
thought I
about
had a
to hear
copy.
about doggies. Okay, here we go.
I wrote a book called Always the Next One about my animal rescue stories, but I didn't have a print copy that I could show you.
Oh,
But
neat. No, I'll have to get one of those for, especially for my wife.
I'll send you one.
Thank you.
I'll have to get new copies, and as soon as I get them, I'll send you one. But of all the evidence, and I would say that we're talking mountains of evidence. It's not
Yes.
just one book, it's not just one study, it's thousands and thousands of accounts and decades, even a century or more of research. But of all of this evidence, what I found probably the most compelling were the childhood deathbed experiences.
Hmm.
because you describe in your book several instances where the parents do not want the child to know that the child has got a terminal illness. And in spite of that, and the doctor's best efforts to keep that child ignorant of the true nature of what's going on, they have this vision where they see angels or they see Jesus or they have a very spiritual experience. And then these children, first of all, they accept the fact that they're going to die, and then they get excited about
Yeah,
it.
this
Even
is really odd behavior if you're an atheist as to why they're excited. Children love their mommy. They want to stay close to their mommy. They don't want to, the thought of leaving their mommy or their teddy bear or anything is just terrifying. What in the world could cause these children to be excited about going to the other side? And often it's actually them trying to help their parents to deal with the situation because sometimes their parents haven't come to terms with the fact they're really dying. If you have a 6 or 9 year old child that's dying, you don't come up to them one day and say, "Okay, I'm so sorry. The doctor said that you're probably going to die within the next few weeks." You just don't breach the subject because they don't even understand death. You're afraid of upsetting them. They don't understand these things. So typically they're left in the dark and you don't talk about it. But then for them to say, them to give their own diagnosis and say, "Mommy, I'm going to be leaving. Now I'll be able to see you. You won't be able to see me, but it's going to be okay. I'm going to be in a good place." What does that mean? And I would recommend to a lot of people this book, A Window to Heaven, Diane Comp, MD. She
I
was an
was just about to
academic.
mention her.
It, do you,
I was looking at her notes saying pediatric cancer specialist seeing a lot of dying children. I was just about to mention her.
Okay, it must be a God thing, okay?
It
We'll have
is.
to keep track of these things that happen. But Diane Comp, she was not just your average oncologist next door. She was teaching oncology at Yale University, at School of Medicine, okay? Very well respected. She was also an atheist. She said, "I vacillated between calling myself an atheist and an existentialist." She said, "But I thought if anything's going to convince me that there's a God, I'm going to have to find a reliable witness somewhere." And she found the witness, to her surprise, in the children she was working with. She'd always been told to keep emotional distance from your patients. In her case, she was a kind person. She got involved with the children, with the families. And what convinced her that God was real, that Jesus was real, were the experiences of these children who were dying. And one of them, she said, let's see if I can find it here quickly, said 7-year-old Hannah was dying from leukemia. According to Dr. Comp, before quoting Dr. Comp, before she died, she mustered the final energy to sit up in her hospital bed and say, "The angels, they're so beautiful. Mommy, can you see them? Do you hear their singing? I've never heard such beautiful singing." Then she laid back on her pillow and died. Her parents acted as if they'd been given the most precious gift in the world. And when she began to see patient after patient, and not all children report these experiences. I don't know why God gives the experience to some people and not to others. But isn't this wonderful that a loving God would help a child through this transition to death and they would actually be excited going to the other side? And again, what can explain the timing of this? That's terminal lucidity. Right at the end, you have this very lucid moment, and she's saying what she saw. Now you say, okay, maybe it was just a hallucination based on this or that. But some of them say things like one person did a doctoral dissertation, I believe it was in nursing, on children at death and talking about these experiences, is specifically what she was researching. And one of the children talked about told her mom, was trying to explain to her mom about her death, and she said, "Mom, can you see the angels in the room?" And her mom, wanting to have a conversation and identify with the child, said, "Yes, I see them." And the child said skeptically, okay, this is a real skeptic for you, says, okay, mom, what do they look like? And the mom says, oh, the one I'm seeing has these big wings. And the child says, mommy, you don't have to lie to me. They don't have wings. And then you say, okay, if a child is going to have a hallucination of angels in our culture, they're going to have wings. But
Absolutely.
biblically, we see some creatures in heaven that are told to have cherubim or whatever that it said had wings. But actually, when you look at the creatures called angels, none of them are said to have wings. That's just something our culture has added to all the pictures. And that's one thing that impressed Sir William Barrett is so many of the children that he saw would talk about it, and they wouldn't talk about death in the cultural terms that they had heard. They would say something like, "Oh, there's," somebody might say, "Oh, there are mansions on the other side," because the King James version speaks of mansions. In my house there are many mansions. And she said, "I don't see any mansions. What are we talking about?" Actually, that means dwelling places. But the children were very honest about what they saw and didn't see. If it were this were something that was just coming from their culture, their idea of death, wouldn't they see angels with wings? And sometimes you have a child who another child friend was dying at a remote hospital, and this one reported seeing that child as she was dying, and she didn't, nobody even knew this other child had just died. So you've got elements that you can check for corroboration to see that these are not just hallucinations. And by the way, hallucinations ought to be all over the place. Hallucinations, Penny Sartori, when she studied near death experiences in England for her doctoral dissertation in a critical care unit. So this was all kinds, not just heart attacks, but she actually pulled together the hallucinations, and then she pulled together the deathbed or near death experiences and showed that the hallucinations were just infinitely varied. You'd have a person who had been in a fire accident, and they would have a hallucination that somebody was cooking them over a spit or something. And they were just all over the board. But these near death and deathbed experiences, they're consistent. People see deceased relatives, they see angels, they see beautiful landscapes, they may talk to God. And an interesting difference between near death and deathbed experiences, I don't see them contradicting at all, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody in a deathbed experience have a life review. If life reviews were caused by a dying brain, why wouldn't we see it in the deathbed experiences? We see them, it's a core part of the experience of a near death experience. When you think about it, if this is a God thing where He's directing the experience, the people that are at a halftime point in their life have an opportunity to change their lives. So they need, some of them may need a life review to say, you've been on the wrong track. You're full of pride. You're hurting people with your language. You need to get on the right track. But a person who's just dying, they don't need a life review. They're just about to die, right? So that's a
Hmm.
difference in those two experiences, which to me makes sense with the hypothesis that God is causing these things or allowing them to happen for a specific reason.
I agree with you completely. You mentioned in the book a case of a child named Daisy Dryden, and you made the note that she announced prior to her death that she knew the exact time of day that she was going to die. She was going to die at 11:30 p.m. And unfortunately, I didn't make other notes about that, but it reminded me of this story, this polymath, a guy named Emanuel Swedenborg, who back in the 1700s, he was very renowned as a astronomer, a physicist, a chemist. He was just very talented, and he began to dabble in the occult. And what he did was he became profoundly religious, and he very adamantly suggested to anyone else that they should not dabble in the occult because the entities that with whom he was in contact were constantly lying to him and trying to deceive him. But
Mhm.
he had several documented remarkable experiences. One, he's at a dinner party about 100 miles from his house, and he suddenly goes into a trance like state. And when he comes out, he says, "My house is burning to the ground."
Hmm.
And that was back before they had telephones and that sort of thing. And several days later, he received notice that his house had been burning down at the exact time that he made that announcement. But the whole reason I'm bringing him up was exactly as in the case with Daisy Dryden, he predicted, if you will, the exact time of day that he was going to die, and that's when he died. I'm
Yeah,
wondering, go
I,
ahead.
I, I think so. Some people would say, okay, they overheard a doctor telling them that they were going to die or whatever. And in some cases, that might make sense. But there's actually been a study, I believe it was in the British Medical Journal, which is one of the most highly regarded medical journals in the world. And there was an article where they studied physicians who were dealing with the dying to see how accurate they were in predicting the time of death. Now, if somebody was bleeding out profusely and they couldn't stop it, they could pretty much predict within an
Sure.
hour or so of when this person is going to bleed out and die. But we're talking about long term illnesses like cancer that they typically can't even get the right week, much less the day or the hour. And they tend to overestimate the time that they're going to live. Maybe they're just compassionate or whatever. But when it comes to cancer, it's just hard to predict unless they're right at their last breath what's going to happen. So when somebody talks and says, with in terminal lucidity, typically these people will all of a sudden be lucid, say their goodbyes, and then boom, they die. That's almost like a prediction. They come out of their comatose situation and they talk and then they die. But there are others that will actually give a time of death. And I think Steve Jobs is an example. He was dying of pancreatic cancer. He had it for some time. He was still very lucid, but then one day he called his sister in New York and said, "If you want to see me, you better come out now." And she flew right out. How did he know he was about to die? He was very lucid. She got there and saw him. And this comes from her remarks. I think they were printed in the New York Times, like a obituary for him. But she said when she got there, he looked like he was doing fine. He was cutting up with his family, with his wife, just seemed to be having a good time. And she thought he doesn't look like he's going to die at all. But within, I think that night, he just started going downhill. And the last words he said were, wow. And he was looking kind of the corner of the room like a lot of people do right before they die. I think he was just seeing something of the other side. I actually had one of my students who told me of his grandfather's death. He was in the hospital. He called in his family and said, "I'm going to die." I believe he said in 4 or 7 days. He gave an exact number of days. He said, "I'm going to die, and I want to tell y'all some things before I die." Sure enough, he died on that day. So this is something that happens regularly, and you say, "How do they know how do they know when they're going to die?" Bertrand Russell, the most famous atheist of his time in the mid 1900s and early 1900s, somebody asked him, if you were to be convinced that there was a God, what would it take? And he said, if I could be told somehow from the other side exactly what was going to happen the next day, and it was things that couldn't have been predicted, he said, I think that would at least convince me there's some kind of intelligence on the other side. And I thought, Bertrand, that's exactly what they were studying at Cambridge while you were there, and you've not had the curiosity to go look into it yet. But also, these deathbed experiences, terminal lucidity, and people telling about their time of death. And some of these people weren't even sick and knew they were just about to die and said their goodbyes, and people didn't believe them, then they might be murdered the next day. And these are well documented. This is not stuff I'm pulling off the internet from who knows who.
Oh, I believe you completely because like I said, I am very fascinated with all of this type of phenomena, and I research it nonstop, basically.
I can't understand why so many atheists and so-called skeptics, we consider ourselves skeptics. We're skeptical of these things. That's why when somebody tells me something happened, I think, okay, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. They said Mrs. Sidgwick, she said in a biography of her, I believe it was by her sister or daughter, but she said you couldn't ever convince her that anything had really happened. She was okay. So that somebody reported that. Maybe it happened. Maybe it didn't. And that's the way I am. Somebody will
Well,
say Donald Trump did something. And I'll say, okay, maybe he didn't. Or current president did something. Maybe he did, because it's going through so many channels. I just tend to, unless I've got good documentation, I don't tend to believe it. But it's just amazing to me that so many so-called skeptics that are atheists just refuse to look at all this evidence. I've hardly seen any that have diligently gone in to look at the evidence. I just think they're not interested in stuff like this.
I just watched a video earlier this morning of Dennis Prager, and he was talking about being invited to debate an atheist in Minnesota. And he was in a room of about 400 atheists. And he asked them, who in here ever has doubts about their atheism? And he said, nobody raised their hand.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And doesn't that just say it all? They have reached a conclusion, and then they form a block in their own mind so that no new information can penetrate that block and change their mind. Their minds are closed, so they
Yeah,
won't even look at this type of information.
it's a
They'll just,
scary thing.
yeah, it's just like with Michael Shermer. He says it's an anecdote even when it's his own experience.
Yeah, I don't believe my own experiences. Really? That's pretty wild. Jana Harmon wrote a book, Atheists Finding God. She did her PhD dissertation on, let's see if I can get it close enough here.
Yeah, I got it.
Unlikely stories of conversions to Christianity in the contemporary West. She interviewed 50 atheists who had become theists and Christians to find out what their journey consisted of. Typically, I don't, in fact, I don't remember any of the atheists she interviewed who became atheists by trying to read the best of both sides. Typically, they might have had a problem with somebody that died and they didn't like the idea of God after that. The problem of evil hit them. And then they read some atheist literature. It all made sense. Then they'd start ridiculing Christians and religious people because they didn't have any evidence, but they had really not even read the other side. But they were doggone sure that what they believed was right, that they held the intellectual high ground, that all these religious people were idiots, and they would express it awfully. They just really didn't like religious people. That had no respect for them. It seemed like, typically, okay. But what would happen is they would have to come to some kind of crisis point in their life that opened up their mind to begin their search. Maybe they met a Christian later in life that they fully respected, and the person understood apologetics and began talking to them about evidence and would actually have conversations about their side of things. And eventually that would lead to them considering God and Christianity. Or the person might have some kind of a vision or near death experience, or a vision, something in their own life. And again, they typically wouldn't just immediately accept Christ, but that would put them on a search. And Jesus said, seek and you shall find. Seek and keep on seeking in the original Greek, it says. So I think that some kind of crisis had to happen to where they were first open to even looking at the evidence. And then when they began to do that over time, they became believers. Very interesting book. Right now, it's published by an academic press, probably mainly for libraries, so it's pretty expensive. Maybe you can find in a library if it's too expensive for you, or maybe it'll come out in paperback soon, I hope.
Atheist finding God. I'm making a note.
Some atheists do make that don't make that change. Of course, C.S. Lewis made that change, and we know a lot of prominent people who made that change as they went along. And what impresses me about near-death studies is that so many people just really didn't believe in these things at all, like Dr. Sabom.
You
Grace of
said that you were skeptical before you read Heaven is for Real.
I by that time, apologetic material, reading out the evidence for the trustworthiness of the New Testament, the records we have of Jesus' life, all those things had led me to a belief in God and the afterlife. But when I
Oh,
read
I
Heaven
just
is
meant
for Real,
skeptical.
I had no belief in near death experiences at all. I just thought
Exactly.
it was a private experience. What possible apologetic impact could that have on me or anyone other than the experiencer? So I just didn't know this whole body of research was there. Very skeptical of it, just didn't believe it. And even after reading Heaven is for Real, I thought, well, you just got to leave the family. But I saw a little blurb on the outside where a physician said he had been studying these and this experience was consistent with his research. And I thought, who's been researching this stuff? So that got me into the research, and I started saying, oh my goodness, this stuff has been happening all around me, and I had no idea.
I felt the same way when I read your book on deathbed experiences. I'd been interested in the near death experience for years,
Right.
decades. But the idea of research into the deathbed experience was it was just completely out of left field to me, and but in a very good way. I was very excited to find that research and add it to the body of evidence that leads me to conclude that God exists and Jesus was who he said he was.
And I would look at Osis and Harrelson wrote a book. I'm trying to come up with it here so I can put it in front of you. But Osis and Harrelson wrote a book, and it has been republished several times, and it is on deathbed experiences. That's really a fascinating study that I don't think I talk about a lot in that book, but that's what originally let me know that there'd been research in that area. 1950s, 1960s, you had some wealthy people who wanted to know if there was evidence for the afterlife, and they helped to fund their research. Those are interesting stories in themselves. But they surveyed like maybe 1,000 people, sent surveys to maybe 1,000 people in the United States, narrowed it down, began to interview the people. This was physicians and nurses that had observed the dying. So they put that together in a study. And then they said, maybe the Christian heritage here has influenced what they see. Let's go do the same thing in India. And they went over there. It was the inventor of the Xerox machine, the first printer machine, that sponsored them for that research. So they came back and they said, this is a cross cultural experience. Why are those people experiencing the same thing we do when when we're miles apart in our worldviews? It seems like this is evidence of an afterlife, and that was their conclusion. So lots of study has been done. It's not talked about much these days, but fortunately, it's being studied again, particularly because of Dr. Kerr, KER, and others that have been at a New York hospice publishing several different articles in peer reviewed journals on deathbed experiences. They actually interviewed the patients, terminally ill patients who were in an in house facility each morning, asking if they had had that experience. And they found that over 80% of them were, which makes it almost intrinsic to dying. And this is a powerful experience. So if you look up Dr. Kerr, he's actually got a YouTube video. It's a TED Talk. So look up TED Talks, Dr. Kerr, and I forgot the name of the video, but he'll give a little introduction. He was turned off to religion early in life for some reason, so he tries to not deal specifically with the afterlife thing. But you look at all the evidence that they're bringing, you're saying, "Wow, that's good evidence for the afterlife." But again, he's one of those kind of skeptical guys who he knows something spiritual is going on, but he doesn't know quite what to make of it. But I'm so glad that he and others are reintroducing this type of study to the current research, because all the talk is about near death experiences. And to me, the deathbed experiences A lot of great research there in the past that we need to be reaping from. So that's what I try to put in my book on deathbed experiences for people who want to go in depth. And I appreciate you mentioning my writing. I was a youth minister at one time, so I still try to write with youth. And I got 7 boys in a blended family. I'm trying to think in terms of communicating with them on more of a senior and high school level, but I just want to research the hound out of it so that I've got all the documentation. So if you want to go deeper, you can. I deal
Well,
with lots of detail. I document it, but I try to write it in a way that people can understand it.
like I said, it's a very conversational style. It's just like you're sitting in a rocking chair telling me these stories, and I only get the academic slant on it at the end of the chapter when you hit me with the Q&A sections.
Okay. Cool. Cool. We have to appease those academics at some point. Josh McDowell told me a long time ago when I was writing on contemporary music back in the 1980s, early 1990s. He said if you gear it toward the popular crowd and allow them to read it, said the academics will have to pay attention to it eventually because everybody else is reading it. But if you appeal to academics, they're the only ones you're going to get. So I try to write in a very popular way and just document it well and put the emphasis on the on how good my arguments are and my research is rather than using technical language, which I think just obscures things and takes away. If I can't put it so that a high schooler can understand it, I probably don't understand it yet.
That was great advice you got.
Yes,
Dr. Miller, once again, it's been a pleasure. I see that I've already taken up another hour and a half of your time. It just flies by when we're having these conversations.
I'm having a good time as well. You're a great interviewer, and we have such a good ability to talk back and forth. I appreciate your interviews and just your interest in these things. You've done your own writing on apologetics, and I appreciate that.
Again, I was thrust into the whole I'm a writer now by Richard Dawkins because he said something on television one day that I just couldn't abide by. He said that cars and computers and cell phones are all intelligently designed, but a human being is not.
Mm.
And I'm not a huge proponent of intelligent design because I believe in creation. I believe that you can't even contemplate whether evolution is possible until creation has already occurred. So the if you want to call God an intelligent designer, that's what I'll call him. But the evidence for me is overwhelming, and your research is to me some of the most fascinating aspects of evidence that I had to offer in my book. The near death experience and now the informational deathbed experience, which didn't make it into my book, but might make it into a future revision. But
Oh, we're still learning all the time.
as
So,
long as we're breathing, we're going to continue to learn.
yeah, I'm so glad to have made your acquaintance, and it'll be fun following each other on our intellectual and spiritual journey as we continue along in life and keep learning.
It's been a blessing to get to know you and to be able to say that I've met you in person. And I look forward, I'll be back in touch. You've still got a couple other books we haven't discussed.
Let's get back together. I'll look forward to it.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, John. God bless you. And thanks for everybody who's watching.
God bless you too. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.